for us to do that. So with that in mind, so come on out and join us. Hey, we have been in this series I've called the J Crew, Jesus Crew, for 8 weeks or so now. We've been talking about the original followers of Jesus, the 12 disciples. So we've covered, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. If I can remember all of them, Philip, Nathaniel, and last week was Matthew, the tax collector. So today we've got a brand new person we're going to take a look at, and so help us kind of say what were they like, and how does that impact us? So we can look at their lives, look at the things that they did, things they said, and so we can learn about them, but also about ourselves. We can learn about God and His relationship and interaction with them, because the way He interacts with them is the way He interacts with us, and so it's important for us to learn that and to grow from that. So here's how I want to start today off is, do you ever feel like when you come to church, whether here or another church, or when you roll up in here, like, you ever feel like everybody's kind of got it together but me? I mean, in other words, you ever go and think, it seems like whenever I go to Grace Point that everybody else seems happy, everybody else seems very loving, but like, if they could see me, I'm just like barely hanging on, and like I feel afraid. And so I would say there's probably some of you who come that way. And also, do you feel like if you're here, maybe you feel like, it seems like everybody else who goes to church has all the answers, and all I have are questions. And if that's you, today is for you. And so just to let you know, I want you to look around the room. Just go ahead and let's make it weird. Just look around, because you've been wanting to do that anyway for quite some time. And so as you do that, here's what I want to tell you. The people around you are in the same boat you're in. They're struggling just like you are. I know on the outside they look like they got it all together. And look, when you come listen to me and I get to speak, and it's like, man, he has so much confidence. He just knows what he believes. He's got it all together. But that ain't always true. And so I want to encourage you that if you're here and you're struggling with some doubts, today is for you. The guy we're going to look at today struggled with some doubts. And so if you're there, that you're going to find some common ground with him. So if you follow Jesus, are you going to still struggle with doubts? And the answer is yes. I don't know if you knew this, but in this book that covers all these people of great faith, you need to understand the majority of them struggled mightily with doubts and uncertainties and difficulties, so that you are not alone. There are people throughout this book that had bouts with doubts. In other words, they continually had these real difficult moments in their life, and understanding what God was up to and understanding what He was doing with their life. Even some of the great people in the Bible, such as Job, who went through major difficulties, struggled with God and had some doubts. John the Baptist, who was the guy who was like pointing to Jesus, he struggled with some doubts, really understanding, even though he's the one that said, here's the Son of God, here's the Messiah, he struggled with doubts. And so if they did, we will also. And so today, as we take a look at this Jesus Crew member, this one of the 12, this particular guy has some doubts. And what I want to say to you is that with his doubts, it didn't disqualify him from following Jesus. And I would even offer to you, it didn't disqualify him from heaven, that I believe that he is with Jesus now in heaven after he passed away. And so let's ask the question this way. Which of the disciples is known for doubt? Thomas. So you guys know the word. If you don't know, there's a guy named Thomas. He's one of the 12. He's our character today. Like, his whole life on earth is characterized by one episode in his life found in the Gospels, and he's tagged with forever Doubting Thomas. Like, nobody else in the disciples was really tagged like that. Nobody's like betraying Judas or anything like that. We know that Judas betrayed, but denying Peter. But Thomas gets named Doubting Thomas. It's so much so that it's almost like his first name. He's Doubting Thomas. That's who he is. And so he's known for this. And to catch us up, in case we're new to the Bible and new to the New Testament, new to the Gospels, let me tell you briefly why he's known as Doubting Thomas. But obviously, he doubted something. What did he doubt? He doubted what we would all doubt. So he walked around with Jesus for 3 years. Jesus told his 12, I'm going to die, and then I'm going to come back from the dead. And so you got to put yourself in their shoes, which is part of what this whole series is about. So I need to understand where they're coming from. And so Thomas is a guy who he walked with Jesus, saw him for 3 years, and then Jesus was crucified, and then he was resurrected from the dead. And then one day, the disciples were all gathered up in this, it's called the upper room. And they were really hiding out because they knew that the religious leaders had already killed Jesus. They knew that they were looking for them. They're looking for Jesus, so they're hiding out. So the 10 of them, because Thomas is not going to be there, and Judas is not there because he's already betrayed Jesus and went out to hang himself. So they're up in this upper room, and Jesus shows up in the midst of them. So 10 disciples are there. They get to see Jesus resurrected all together. Now, we don't know where Thomas was. I don't know if they sent him out for lunch, so he'd go down the street to get lunch for everybody. We don't know exactly where Thomas was. So Jesus is in the room with the disciples. He leaves. Thomas comes in. And the other 10 go, dude, you ain't going to believe what just happened. Jesus was just right here with us. Jesus was in the room with us. He showed up in the room. We talked. We looked at his scars. We ate together. Jesus was with us. And Thomas says, I don't believe you. Almost as if they were playing a trick on him. And Thomas says, unless I touch his wounds, on his hands, his feet, side, I can't believe it. And so he got tagged, Doubting Thomas, which all of the disciples were doubting. So the 10 just got to be in the room when Jesus showed up, but Thomas gets tagged with that. All of the disciples, all of them, doubted that Jesus was resurrected. Jesus had told them this was going to happen, but they didn't go down to the tomb and wait for it. They were trying to decide, what do we do now? Well, do we go back to fishing? Or we go back to tax collecting? What do we do? And so all of them really doubted. You'll see that as we look at the episodes of Thomas's life today. And so they doubted. So I think it's important for us as we continue this conversation today to get some definitions down. And so I want to ask you this question, and we get you to think about it. And I don't know if you ever thought about it before, but I think it's important for us to understand. What is the difference between doubt and unbelief? What is the difference between doubt and unbelief? And that's an important question because one, you're going to struggle with, the other you hopefully are not going to be in. And so let's talk about doubt for a second. Doubt, I think, is a matter of the mind. It's a matter of your thought processes and knowledge. Doubt is when we don't know something with certainty. It's something that we all struggle with, and it's not understanding. When the New Testament talks about it, it's not understanding what God is doing, how he's going to do it, and why he's going to do it. And so we all struggle with doubt, and so we face uncertainty. The nature of faith itself is that there is some uncertainty, because if you didn't, it wouldn't be faith if you knew with certainty. So faith, by its nature, means there will be some doubt. And so doubt is something that I think we struggle with. It often surfaces when things are not going the way we'd like, or we got troubled in our mind, or have some brokenness of heart. Doubt also doesn't mean that you don't want to believe. When I doubt something, it's not saying I don't want to believe it. It's just having some mental effort to say, I got to be able to take the leap. I got to be able to buy into that. And right now, I'm just not there. It's not that I don't want to believe. I want to believe, but I'm just not there yet. It's trying to face that uncertainty. And so doubt is also, I'm going to suggest to you, a weakness in us and not in him. In other words, the doubt that I have is not about who he is and what he can do. The doubt is about my ability to understand and cling to who he is and what he said and what he can do. So let's shift. Okay, so if that's doubt, then what is unbelief? Unbelief, I want to offer to you, is a matter of the will, where doubt is a matter of intellectual issues, where unbelief is more centered on volitional issues. Unbelief is choosing not to believe, no matter really what the evidence says. Doubt is, I really want to believe, and if I have enough evidence, I think I can take that leap. I think I can move into faith, where unbelief is, I don't really care how much you show me, how much you tell me, I am unwilling to believe. Doubt is a struggle with something that's uncertain, where unbelief is a state, a condition that we are in, saying, I will not believe. It is volitional by nature. Unbelief is saying that there's not a weakness in me, in my understanding. There's a weakness in God and who he is. It is, unbelief is saying, I do not believe that God is who he says he is. I do not believe that God can do what he says he can do. I do not believe that God can nor will do that in the future. Unbelief is saying that God is weak. He is either not powerful enough, he is not wise enough, or he is not loving enough. And so you see the difference between doubt and unbelief. Is a person who believes in Jesus, I will struggle with doubt, but unbelief cannot be a part of my life. Now, doubt can lead us into unbelief, but my hope here today is that our doubt leads us toward Jesus, not away from Jesus. Doubt that wants to believe and looks even harder at the evidence in order to believe. The difference in the guys who followed Jesus is they were not but one, a person of unbelief, Judas. The other 11 struggled with doubt. They struggled with it mightily. Imagine if you were them and you walked around with Jesus. The things he said and the things he did would be hard to swallow. The difference would be between those disciples, those 11 who followed Jesus, versus the Pharisees. The Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day who wanted Jesus dead, their lives were marked with unbelief. No matter what Jesus did, they would not admit that Jesus was the Son of God. They would not ever come to the grips that he was Messiah. They did not believe. They were in a state of unbelieving. The disciples just had questions and uncertainty about what Jesus was saying, what Jesus was doing. How could this be true? But they followed him, where the Pharisees did not. And so my hope is that you're not in unbelief, but my hope is that you are just struggling with doubt. So Thomas struggled with doubt. Let's get a few facts down about him before we jump into the three major episodes of his life. One is the only interactions we have with Thomas in the New Testament are found in John's Gospel. Now, he's mentioned in the list with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the other three, what we call the synoptic Gospels. But in John, we get the interactions that Thomas had with the other disciples and even Jesus. And so we learn more about him through those conversations. Also, we will learn as we read through these episodes of his life, we don't get a lot of information about his backgrounds in terms of what he did. You remember, like, Peter and Andrew were fishermen, and Matthew's a tax collector. We don't know exactly what Thomas did for a living. But we do find out this important piece of information. Thomas was a twin. Matter of fact, as we read through 2 of the episodes, it will say about Thomas, called the twin, it's Didymus. And so you ever know somebody who's twins? You know, like I had a guy on my football team in high school. There were 2 twins, and that's the way they referred to him. He's the twin. And so originally, that's who Thomas was. He was not doubting Thomas. He was Thomas the twin. And so that's how the people referred to him. But after the episode that we find in the Gospels, that 3rd episode we'll look at, that's when he became doubting Thomas, not just, hey, he's the twin. So what we discover when we look at Thomas's life is that he was a twin. And then we don't have a lot of information about Thomas. But here's what I want to offer to you, is that Thomas was a bit on the skeptical side. That he was a person who came at things with a bit of skepticism. Now, if you're skeptical, you probably look at everybody and say, I am skeptical, but I have a healthy skepticism. And so that's maybe the way that you look at it. And others around you may say, no, you're just skeptical. And then there's that kind of fits with maybe you are a pessimistic person, that you see the worst, you assume that bad things are going to happen. And I want to offer to you that this is maybe the way that Thomas really was as he interacted with people. That if we were to make him a character from Winnie the Pooh, who would he be? Eeyore. You know any Eeyores in your life? Don't point. Eeyores. No matter what's happening, you just expect the worst. I have a cup in my office, and it says the glass is half empty, half full. And, I think Thomas would say, man, it's half empty. He would see the negative side. And so as we walk through these episodes, I want to point that out to you. I want you to read it that way, because I think that's the way that maybe he was. So let's take a look at the first episode. Everybody still with me? All right, John chapter 11. Let me catch you up to what's happening in John chapter 11, because if we read all these texts, it takes us, I'll never get through on time. So John chapter 11, John chapter 10, what's just happened is Jesus has landed on the religious leaders that he's God. He's the Messiah. They're having a hard time with it. Matter of fact, let me say it this way. If anyone tells you that Jesus never claimed to be God, they are intellectually dishonest when it comes to the New Testament. Because the reason that religious leaders wanted him dead, the reason they wanted him crucified, was because he claimed to be God. They didn't dislike him because he was a good teacher. They didn't dislike him because he did miracles. They disliked him because he said he was God. And that's why they wanted him killed. As a matter of fact, when they were in Judea, around Jerusalem, and Jesus landed this on the religious leaders, it says in chapter 10 that they looked to arrest him. They wanted to stone him to death, because that was a sin in their eyes of blasphemy. And it was worthy of being taken outside the city and stoned to death. So they ducked out of the city and went on their way. John chapter 11 picks up. Jesus has a family that he's friends with. It's made up of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Lazarus is a guy that obviously Jesus had a relationship with, in terms of they were good friends, and he was friends with his family. They were from the town of Bethany, which is about 1.5 miles from Jerusalem. Jesus gets word that Lazarus is sick, like really sick. I mean, hospital, intensive care kind of sick. He's going to die. Mary and Martha, the sisters, send word to Jesus. But in order for Jesus to go heal him, Jesus would have to go back to this area where they just wanted to kill him. So does Jesus go back to heal a guy to a place where they want to kill him? That's the dilemma. And so I want to read to you the story, and you'll see where Thomas shows up in the story. So feel the tension in the story. Chapter 11, verse 5, it'll be on the screen. Now Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. And that's important for John to write that, because you might think after you read these next verses that Jesus didn't love them, because Jesus doesn't come immediately. Here's what it says. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed for 2 days longer in the place he was. That don't sound like love, does it? They weren't feeling the love. Then after this, he said to his disciples, let us go to Judea again. And this is where Jerusalem is. This is where Bethany is. And the disciples said to him, Rabbi, teacher, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you. Are you going to go there again? Do you feel the tension? So the disciples are like, wait a minute, Jesus. You think we really need to go there? They want blood. They want to take your life. And Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in a day? Yes. If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light from the light of this world. But if anyone walks at night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. He's saying it's about the truth. Jesus knows the truth. If you're with Jesus, then you're going to have the light. After saying these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. And the disciples get confused. Here's what they say. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover. Like, why are we going to go back there? If Lazarus is just asleep, that's good, because if you're sick, you need to sleep, you need to get your rest. He's going to recover. I don't think we need to go back there. Don't you remember they're trying to kill you? Now, Jesus had spoken of Lazarus' death, but they thought he meant taking a rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. Sometimes God needs to be really straight with us. I don't think you're getting it. He's not asleep. He's dead, okay? He's dead. So, and then he says, and for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there. I'm glad I didn't go back so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So here's what Jesus said. I'm glad we weren't there because y'all need to see more of who I am so you can overcome your doubts. What did I tell you about the disciples? All of them struggled with doubts. They all struggled with getting their minds wrapped around who Jesus was and what he could do. So Thomas, called the twin, notice it didn't say, so doubting Thomas, but so Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Now, I don't know how you read that. I think there's like two ways you could read it. I had oral interpretation at Mercer University back when I was in college. Anybody ever have oral interpretation? Anybody ever heard of that? Okay. Y'all need to get schooled. All right. So anyway, it was a class where, because I would take public speaking courses and stuff like that. This class was like, you would have to read orally stories in the class and almost like acting them out. So if you had to do this story, if you were Thomas and you had to speak, how would you say what he said? And I was talking to a pastor friend on Monday. The subject of Thomas came up. I think we were having a discussion, and they asked me what I was preaching on. I said, hey, we're doing this Jesus Crew thing. And he said, well, who's next? I said, well, Thomas is next. He goes, yeah, I think Thomas gets a bad rap. Because of that one episode in his life, he gets tagged with being, doubting. But like in this passage in John 11, it sounds like, Thomas is loyal. He's ready to go die with Jesus. And you could read it that way. I mean, how would you read it? So Thomas said, let us also go that we may die with him. Kind of Braveheartish. But I don't think that's the way it reads. I think this is Eeyore. You hear it? Oh, let us also go. And we may die with him. That's the way I think it reads. Because I think that's who Thomas is. I think he struggles with his skepticism, his pessimism. Look, there's all kinds of reasons why we struggle with doubt. I think one of the reasons is just in our weaknesses from sin and the fall, that we're just bent toward negativism. So I'd say, like, one of the reasons why I think Thomas does and all of us do is it's in our nature to assume the worst, because since the fall, that's what we've come to expect. We're just bent toward it. like many of us from birth. And like some of us are even more so that way. It's kind of in our wiring. It's in our temperament. We are just kind of a bent toward a negativity about how things are going to happen. And so we become like a little bit Eeyorish about life. Because of our weaknesses and our nature, it causes us to look at things and expect negative things. I mean, that's part of our nature, but it's also, I think, the way you've been nurtured. It may be from your home life that you were nurtured that way. You may have grown up in a home where a little bit of a scarcity mentality versus a family that might have a little abundance mentality. And so, we are always expecting the worst, so we're going to hold on to our stuff. We're going to hold on really tight. Where there are other families, man, they just give and they just do, they just let it go. They operate with a little more faith. And so I think that we all struggle with that based on nature, based on nurture. Like you live in a culture, by the way, that is nurturing doubt. That is nurturing negativity. Just go on social media and tell me, when you go on social media, do you leave there and go, man, I'm encouraged. Look at all the good news and all the nice things that people have to say. No. Because negativity is a part of our culture. It's the news that comes out, whether social media or just regular media, it tends to be negative because that's what sells. It's what plays well with us. It's what we tune into. Matter of fact, I was reading another book just a few weeks ago, and it said out of the emotional words that we use to describe emotion, 66% of the words are negative emotions. We are bent toward it, and I think some of us even more so, like Thomas, are bent toward that. And so I think when you read Thomas, I think he's just like, well, let's go to. We can die with him. John 14, episode 2. Jesus is meeting with his disciples, and they find out that Jesus is going to die. Jesus tells them, institutes the Lord's Supper, and so Judas betrays him. And I think Jesus senses that they are struggling with doubt, that they are like, what in the world is going on? Why is Jesus being such a downer? And so he encourages them. John 14, he says this. He said, let not your hearts be troubled. Don't freak out on me. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms, and if it were not so, would I have told you that I go prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And he said, you know where I'm going. And Thomas said, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? And then Jesus drops that incredible line on him. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and life. No man comes to the Father but through me. Jesus says, I'm the way. But I want to go back to what Thomas said. So how do you read it? As you're in oral interpretation class right now, and you got to come up here and read it. How do you read what Thomas said to him? I think it reads with that undertone of pessimism, skepticism, doubt. I think it reads, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How are we going to know the way? I think that's the way it reads. I could be wrong. I'm just suggesting to you, based on what we know about Thomas, that this is really kind of bent in his life. He's like, I don't know. I don't understand. I think this is doubt. I mean, because Jesus is like, you know the way. The path is a person. You know the way to God is through me. But Thomas is struggling with that. and here's something I think is really important for us to say. I want to say before we get done today. Thomas has questions. And what I want you to not miss is this. Jesus is not afraid of his questions. he entertains them. He hears him. And neither is Jesus. He's not afraid of them, and he's not angered by them either. In other words, God is not angered or afraid of you asking him questions. I would offer to you, he even invites you to do so. He says to him, you know the way. Lord, we don't know the way. Jesus says, I am the way. He deals with him in a way that he deals with us. That God has gone through extraordinary lengths so that we could overcome our doubts. And I want you to see this as good news. Is that God is okay with your questions. It is not wrong for you to ask God questions. Now, God is not obligated to answer you. You are not over him. In other words, there's a right way to question God, and I would offer to you, there's a wrong way to question God. If you question God by saying, God, I don't understand. I have doubts. I need your help. Can you help me to understand? And you ask a question of God, I think he's perfectly fine with that. As a matter of fact, I would even offer to you that he wants you to come to him in that way. But if you question him like you are a judge over him, as if you know better than he does, and that you sit in judgment of what he does, then that kind of questioning is wrong. And there's a difference between the two. If my questions are arising out of my doubt, that's one thing. If my questions are arising from unbelief, that's another thing. Because you are not, and I am not, a judge over God. He is not a man that we would judge him. He is God who judges us. But he invites you with your doubts to come to him. That's what he does with Thomas, and he doesn't get onto him or rebuke him because he asked. Which leads us to episode 3. In John chapter 20, this is the episode we spoke of at the beginning, and so I want us to read it together. This is where Thomas was left out. Dude, Jesus was just here. I don't believe unless I see it. If I touch it, I got to see it. So let's take a look at this episode. Now, Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin. John wants to make sure you know exactly who he's talking about. Was not with them when Jesus came. When Jesus showed up in the room, Thomas wasn't there. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see his hands, the mark of the nails, place my finger into the mark of the nails, place my hand into his side, I will never believe. I mean, you put yourself in Thomas's shoes. You went out to get lunch, you're bringing it back, you got the sack for the other 10 guys. You walk in the room, and they're like, dude, Jesus was just here. Would you expect him just to drop the bag? And, yeah. He's like, I don't believe you. I don't know if that's because he played a lot of jokes on Thomas over the last 3 years. Not real sure why Thomas wasn't buying it. But he wasn't buying it. And his response was, I don't believe it. And I'm not going to believe it unless I see it. I'm not going to believe it unless I touch where the nails were in his hands and his feet, where the spear went in his side. I can't believe it. So check this out. What are the very next words in the text? 8 days later. Let that set in. A week has gone by. So you use your imagination. A week has gone by, so it's Thomas and the other 10. The other 10 have seen Jesus resurrected. He has not. They're together for a whole week. What are those conversations like? Dude, I'm telling you. Dude, I don't believe you. For a whole week. I mean, think about it. The other 10, how much would they talk about this? How much would they be telling Thomas, dude, you got to believe. We all saw him for a whole week. That's the conversation. Watch what happens. His disciples were inside again. This time Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, so Jesus, in other words, Caspered on them. He just showed up in the room. Peace be with you. Because if Jesus does that, it's going to be a little freaky. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, and put your hand in the place of my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. So in other words, so let's go back to the original story. The disciples in the room, Jesus shows up, Jesus leaves, Thomas comes in, Jesus was here, I don't believe you. A week later, Jesus shows up, and what we have recorded is Jesus looks at Thomas and goes, here, I want you to touch. Right here. He wasn't there, was he? Or was he? Because he's God. He knows exactly what Thomas said. The other disciples didn't go to chase Jesus down and go, hey, when you see Thomas, this is what he wants you to do. Jesus sees him, and he comes in, and he says, hey, I want you to touch. And he says, hey, you need to believe, buddy. And for Thomas, seeing is believing. He gets to touch him, and let's finish the story, right? So Thomas answered and said, my Lord and my God. We just sang it a minute ago. What Thomas discovered was that God was bigger. Jesus was bigger than he thought he was. The other 10 had seen Jesus, and now he's seen. And let me say this too. Thomas gets a bad rap. Yeah, was he doubting? Was he struggling? Yes, he was. But all Thomas was really asking for is what we all ask for. All Thomas was asking for was what the other 10 had already experienced. What Thomas was asking for, I just want to have the same experience that y'all had. I want to see the same evidence that y'all saw. Y'all 10 get to see that, but I didn't get to see it. I want to see what you saw. Then I will believe. That's what he's saying. Because he's struggling in his doubts. And what does Jesus do? He shows up and he does it. And his response is, you're much bigger than I thought. You are my God and my Lord. And he's blown away. And how this affects Thomas's life is this. From this point on, we don't hear much about him, but here's what we know from church tradition. Thomas leaves this moment. Jesus eventually ascends into heaven. The disciples take the gospel out. So he takes the gospel to India. He dies telling people about Jesus who is resurrected, that he struggled with before, to say Jesus is alive, until he's speared to death for what he believed. So doubting Thomas actually is believing Thomas. That's who he is. And I don't want to end the story here because the story didn't end, because we're all Thomas. So here's what Jesus said. Listen to this, because this is where it gets about you. You didn't know you were in the story, but you're in the story. Jesus said to him, Thomas, have you believed because you have seen me? All right, everybody answer the question. Has Thomas believed because he's seen Jesus? Say it loud. Yeah. Yes. Blessed are those who have not seen, yet have believed. Do you know who he's talking about? Us. Everybody from that point on. Well, I didn't get to say it. Man, I believe Jesus showed up and showed me his hand. I'm in. But you don't get that. So how do you believe? You get told about it. Guys like Thomas tell you about it. Guys like John who were there tell you about it. That's how you believe. As a matter of fact, John stops the story and then he tells you why he wrote John's gospel. Listen to this. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples. Here's John saying, look, Jesus did a lot of stuff, like a lot of stuff. which are not written in this book. John's just letting you know, look, just in case, this ain't the whole thing. This is not an exhaustive list of everything that Jesus did when we were with him. Jesus did a lot of other stuff that would blow your mind. And then he says this, but these stories, these signs, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So here's what John's saying to you and me. Look, I'm telling you about Thomas because we're all a little bit like Thomas, but you need to understand, Jesus did a lot of other stuff that I didn't write about because it's not necessary for you to know all the stuff, but you need to know this about Jesus, that he was crucified, he was resurrected, we saw him alive, and that if you'll believe in him, it'll change your life forever. That's what he's writing about. And he says, I'm writing to you to overcome doubt in your life. I'm writing so that you will move from doubting you to believing you. That's why I'm writing. Matter of fact, I would offer to you, that's not just why John wrote. That's why God has allowed all of this to be written so that you believe. That's why it's here. Blessed are you. You believe in Jesus and you didn't see him. And you didn't touch his hands. You didn't touch his side. You didn't see his feet. But you believe because you've heard the word about Jesus. And grace has come into your life and you're just like, I'm just going to believe. I don't understand it all. I can't explain it to everybody. I'm just going to believe that if Jesus rose from the dead, it changes everything. So if you're here and you struggle with doubt, and I get it, I struggle with doubt sometimes too. But I'm the pastor, yeah, I'm the pastor. And life is hard. And sometimes I don't understand everything that's going on in my life. And I deal with uncertainty as well. I think there are two things that can help bolster your faith. The first thing is this, that you stay in the Word. If you're not in the Word, that you get in the Word. And what I mean by that is, so John writes, these things have been written so that you would believe. So if he wrote his gospel for you to believe, what do you think would happen if you read it and learned it and stayed in it? It would bolster your faith, because then you would be able to see Jesus, what he did, and the difference he makes. Virtually everyone that I counseled who is struggling with doubts and they find themselves drifting away from God, when I asked them the question, are you spending time with Jesus in the Word? Every time they say, no. If this is written so that you would believe, what would happen if you read it daily without ceasing? And I mean, like, you got to constantly be reading. I don't do that. But if you stayed in it, if you treated it like it was a meal, and you made sure that you fed on it daily, it would help you with your doubts. Here's the second thing I want to encourage you with. Stay in the Word and stay in community. Do you notice what happened? The disciples were with Jesus. Jesus shows up. Jesus is resurrected. And the 10 guys believe, but the one guy doesn't. What did they do with the one guy that didn't? Dude, you got to go. If you ain't on board, you got to go. He stayed in community with them with his doubts. He stayed in the community even though he wasn't really buying it all. Do you know what needs to happen, and what my hope is for Grace Point? Is that we are people who gather together, who believe in Jesus Christ resurrected. And we love for people who have doubts to be with us. We'd love for you to bring your doubts to this place. We'd love for you to bring your questions to this place. We invite those. So if you're here and you have questions and you have doubts, guess what? You are not alone. And you're welcome here. The Jesus community did not excommunicate the guy because he was struggling. They knew that he needed the same grace that they got. They embraced Thomas as a part of that Jesus crew, and that's what we have to do. Because people like us are going to have bouts with doubts. And they can be overcome when people stay in the Word and they stay in community. And so if you struggle, you're a great person to be a part of Grace Point Church. We understand. I know there's some people in here, man, they look like they got it together. But if you really pull back the curtain, I think you'd find out they too struggle like Thomas. But our hope is that Jesus comes and meets us. As we stay in the Word and we stay in community, we're able to overcome our doubts and believe, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it seems unbelievable. Let's pray. Father, we've all got such a long way to go. Somebody's here today and they have been struggling with faith, with trust, with belief. Pray you set them free to believe. I pray that you would bolster their faith, that you would give them a desire to read your word, which will help us. That you would allow them to be in community with people who would encourage them. Father, as we grow to know you both with our mind and in our relationships, we can overcome the doubts that plague us. And Father, if there's somebody here, they're in a state of unbelief, I pray that you would break the hardness of their heart. And they would just become open to the fact that you are who you say you are, that you have risen from the dead. And today would be the day that they place their faith in you for the very first time, to say, I believe that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead. He forgives my sins and he sets me free. Help us to overcome unbelief. Without you, we cannot do it on our own. And help us as we struggle with doubts. Teach us to believe you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Would you stand and sing with us?